Mehdi Hasan, you have stated that us Aussies have less to worry about than other Western nations. What makes you believe this? And as a journalist, what's your take on Islamophobia, as it is promoted by news, social media, and other types of information outlets?
Mehdi. Wow, two big questions. Thank you. I assume your question about less to worry about is to do with terrorism, which I wrote about last week for ABC. Look, terrorism, I came to Australia to speak at the Crescent Institute, which is a thought leadership networking group in Sydney, and I spoke in Sydney, Melbourne last week. And what I said last week, and I'll say to you all, is this. Terrorism is a deadly threat to our society, no doubt about it, to many of us in this room. But it's not an existential threat to our society, and it's not something we should spend our entire focus, our energy, our resources obsessing over, worrying over. I don't think we should live in perpetual fear of the next terrorist attack, partly because terrorist attacks are thankfully extremely rare, but also because that's what the terrorists want. The whole purpose of terrorism is to terrorize. It's to spread fear and paranoia and suspicion and division, to provoke an overreaction. Terry mentioned it earlier. And I think, you know, to make us do crazy things like invade Iraq or set up Guantanamo Bay, which just leads to more recruits for the terrorists. So my view is, if you really want to defeat the terrorists, don't play their game. Don't live in fear. Don't live in panic and terror. Recognise the threat. It is a threat. But, you know, 5 Australians have been killed on Australian soil over the past 20 years. That's 5 too many. But that's far fewer than are killed in road traffic accidents, in cases of domestic violence. As I wrote in my piece last week, you're more likely, the statistics show, you're more likely to be killed falling out of bed in the morning in Australia than to be killed by a terrorist later in the day in Australia. Now, a lot of politicians...
Well, you're saying Mehdi, you say in Australia, but of course, all Australians would know that 88 Australians were killed in the Bali bombings.
Agreed.
That feels like it happened in our backyard.
Agreed.
For most Australians feel like Bali is part of their life.
Yes, and even if you include the tragic deaths from Bali, even if you include terrorist attacks across the world, the point is that terrorism is a threat, but compared to the other threats we face, both international, geopolitical, and in our everyday lives, from crime, murder, etc., it isn't the threat that some politicians make it out to be. It isn't the threat that some people in the military industrial complex, whatever you want to call it, in security industry, make it out to be. That's what I'm trying to say.
But you wouldn't have said that after 9/11, would you? Because that was a pretty huge threat, and if you added to that,
so this is a very emotive subject. So of course, whenever you talk about this, no one's trying to disrespect anybody who's died. In fact, the opposite. We're trying to say don't allow those deaths to be politicised. But even 9/11, even the year of 9/11, if you include the deaths, I believe the chance of being killed by a terrorist in the United States in 2001 was 1 in 50,000. Over the next decade, it went to something like 1 in several million. I mean, you're more likely in the United States to be killed by your furniture falling on top of you than by a terrorist. I just want to put things in proportion.
I think that's really important, and from a statistical standpoint, that is true. But the way that terrorism makes people feel, and the way that it is reported on the nightly news,
that's the problem.
You don't see an iPhone video of somebody crashing their car. You know, you're saying there are more people that die from car crashes, but you do see an iPhone video from inside a terrorist attack, and that's emotive, and people feel something, and it gets replayed over and over on the 24-hour news cycle.
You and I work in the media, and I would say that's part of the problem.
Exactly.
I think the media have acted as deeply irresponsibly over the last decade, in terms, especially in terms of promoting these people, plastering their faces. A lot of these guys, they want their moment of infamy. They want their moment of notoriety. Let's not give it to them. Let's not play their game.
Okay, let's hear from...
and I didn't get a chance to talk about Islamophobia, but hopefully later. Your second question.
Sorry, Mehdi, I don't really understand the relevance of that comparison. I mean, I haven't met a bunk bed that wants to establish a caliphate and destroy Western liberal values. I mean, there is a fundamental difference between a random act, or a random tragic act, you know, falling out of a bunk bed or having a fridge fall on you or something, and the considered ideological, strategic attempt to spread terror through our society.
How about domestic violence?
Well, again, that's not an organised. There are people within our community and overseas that hate Western society, that do not like liberal democratic values, and do see it as their fundamental goal to destroy them in very destructive and violent ways. Now, the best thing we could do, in my view, to stop that from happening is to stop the attacks from happening. And that's why all these law changes and extra resources we're giving to the police are so important. Because if, and let's hope it never happens, but if there are large-scale attacks, of the nature that Mehdi's outlining. Yes, there would be a risk to our values. Yes, that's what they want to achieve, and that's why we've got to fight so hard to make sure that...
We've just got a